Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling a question I bet a lot of you have thought about at some point. Why do people leave our lives?
Hmm, that's a big one.
It is. And to really dig into it, we're going to be exploring a podcast called Why Does God Remove People from Our Lives? The Deep Truth You Need to Know. The title alone is pretty intriguing, right?
Yeah, it definitely sets a specific tone, framing those departures through a spiritual lens like that.
Exactly. And from what I've listened to so far, they go way beyond just like simple explanations like people growing apart. We're talking about hidden intentions, protection from harm, even the idea that some exits are like clearing the way for something much better down the line.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's not your typical breakup analysis, that's for sure. But before we jump in, I think it's important to acknowledge that losing someone, whether it's a friend, a partner, a family member, it can be really painful and confusing.
Absolutely. We naturally want answers, want to make sense of it. And that's, I think, what this podcast is trying to offer through that spiritual framework.
Okay, so their main idea is that God is actually orchestrating these exits, deciding who stays and who goes.
Right.
I can already see how that might be comforting to some, but maybe a bit unsettling for others. What do you think about that from a psychological standpoint?
Well, it definitely raises questions about our own sense of agency in relationships, doesn't it?
Right.
Like, if we believe a higher power is making these decisions, it could really influence how we process those departures. Feelings of responsibility, blame, even our perception of free will.
Fascinating. So let's get into the first reason the podcast gives. This one might resonate with some folks out there. The idea that sometimes people leave because they didn't truly love us in the first place. And to illustrate this, they use Proverbs 23.67.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. It talks about being wary of those with evil intent, warning that he does not mean what he says. Kind of a stark warning there.
Strong words. That biblical reference uses a really powerful analogy of a meal to make its point, I think, suggesting that some people might present themselves as, nourishing and supportive, but their underlying intentions are anything but.
Yeah, and the podcast even uses terms like emotional blackmail to describe these dynamics. I
Mm,
mean, haven't we all encountered people who, looking back, you kind of wonder if their affection was ever genuine?
absolutely. And that's where something like attachment theory can be helpful, I think.
Okay, yeah, tell me more about that.
Well, you might have heard of secure versus insecure attachment styles. This emotional blackmail the podcast talks about could be a sign of someone operating from an insecure attachment pattern. They're constantly seeking to use others to fulfill their own emotional needs without genuine reciprocity.
That makes sense. But isn't it a bit disempowering to just assume that everyone who leaves was never truly invested?
Yeah.
What about our role in choosing who we let close?
You raise a really important point. Relationships are a two-way street, for sure. Sometimes, yes, we might overlook red flags or make choices that ultimately lead to heartache.
Right. Okay, so the podcast's second reason for people leaving our lives gets a bit more dramatic. They claim that sometimes God removes people because they're actually a threat to us. They even cite Psalm 18.49 about God sheltering us from enemies.
Wow. That taps into a very primal fear, doesn't it? The possibility that someone we trust might actually be harmful. And the podcast really emphasizes that sense of shock, betrayal, saying things like, I would never have believed she could have done this to me.
Yeah, it's intense language for sure. I can definitely see how that would resonate with anyone who's experienced a sudden painful betrayal. But, and maybe this is me being skeptical, isn't it possible that by framing it as divine intervention, we might be overlooking our own responsibility in those situations?
That's an excellent question. It brings up this concept of hindsight bias, basically our tendency to rewrite the past, especially after a negative experience.
Oh, interesting.
So, after a relationship ends badly, we might overemphasize the negative aspects or convince ourselves that the person was always bad news, even if we missed some pretty obvious red flags along the way.
So maybe it wasn't all divinely orchestrated? Maybe we had more agency in the situation than we initially thought?
It's definitely worth considering, looking inward, examining our own choices and patterns in relationships. That's just as important as considering those external factors.
Okay. Reason number 3 from the podcast feels a bit more optimistic. They suggest that sometimes God removes people from our lives to make space for better connections down the line. They even use the story of Moses passing leadership to Joshua as an example.
I see.
Yeah, it really shifts the focus, right? From the loss to the potential that lies ahead. It's not just about who leaves, but who might arrive next.
Yeah, like how those new beginnings might align better with our evolving needs.
Aspirations.
Exactly. Can you elaborate on that a bit more for our listeners?
Sure. This idea connects really well with the concept of personal growth stages.
Right.
As we mature and evolve, what we want and need from our relationships naturally changes too.
Right.
What might have felt fulfilling at one point in our lives might no longer serve us. And letting go of those connections can create space for relationships that are more aligned with who we are now.
It's almost like graduating from one classroom to the next, where the lessons and the classmates are more suited to your current level of understanding.
I like that analogy.
Okay, I'm ready for reason number 4. This one seems to be where the podcast really leans into its spiritual premise. They say God sometimes removes people to deepen our reliance on a higher power, even quoting 2 Corinthians 12:9, which says, "My grace is sufficient."
Okay, so here's where the theological interpretation really comes to the forefront. It's the idea that by stripping away our earthly attachments, we're kind of forced to turn to God for support and fulfillment. It's a concept you find in a lot of spiritual traditions, this idea of surrender, finding strength in something greater than ourselves.
I see. But playing devil's advocate here a little bit, how would this resonate with someone who isn't particularly religious? Would this reason still hold any weight for them?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is yes. Because even without subscribing to a specific belief system, the idea of seeking support in times of need is universal, isn't it?
Yeah, true.
Whether it's turning to friends and family, finding solace in nature, or even just discovering inner resilience, that core principle is there. Difficult experiences can often push us to tap into resources we didn't even know we had.
So even if you don't believe that God is literally removing people from your life, there's still something to be said for the growth that can come from facing those losses and finding strength in unexpected places.
Exactly. It's like developing a whole new set of muscles, emotional and spiritual muscles that make us more resilient, more capable of navigating future challenges.
I love that. Okay, so we've got these 4 reasons from the podcast. People leaving because they didn't truly love us, because they were a threat, because their season in our lives was over, and because it pushes us toward a stronger connection with something greater than ourselves. It's interesting how it shifts the focus away from blame, either towards ourselves or the other person, and toward this broader, more spiritual perspective. What do you think about that shift?
Well, it's certainly thought-provoking.
Mm.
But before we delve too much deeper into that, I think it's important to pause and acknowledge that for some listeners, this whole premise might be raising some red flags.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The idea that someone else, even a divine being, is controlling who enters and exits our lives, that can feel pretty disempowering, can't it?
Exactly. And it's important for us to acknowledge that while this podcast is offering these interpretations, it's crucial for each individual to apply their own judgment, experiences, and knowledge to form their own understanding of these complex dynamics.
So you're saying we shouldn't just blindly accept this framework, but use it as a starting point for deeper reflection, critical thinking.
Precisely. And that brings us to a really important question that the podcast, at least so far, hasn't really addressed.
And that is?
What about our own role in all of this?
Oh.
If we're not just passively accepting whatever comes our way, how much agency do we actually have in choosing who stays and who goes from our lives? So we ended part 1 with this really important question. What about our role in all of this?
Right. Because even if there are, I don't know, spiritual forces at play, I mean, we're not just puppets, right? We have choices to make, actions we take.
Exactly.
And I'm really curious to dig into, like, how much control we actually have when it comes to who stays and who goes from our lives.
Yeah.
Because the podcast we're looking at today, it's very focused on this idea of divine orchestration.
Right.
Which is a fascinating perspective, but it could also maybe make people feel a bit powerless if they take it too literally.
Absolutely. And to be fair to the podcast, they do acknowledge the pain and confusion that comes with loss.
Yeah.
But the emphasis on God removing people,
Yeah.
it could overshadow our own agency, yeah.
So where do we draw the line between divine intervention and just, plain old bad choices or incompatibility issues? Because let's be honest, sometimes relationships just run their course.
Right.
And it's nobody's fault.
That's a really good point. I think it's helpful to remember that relationships exist within this really complex interplay of individual choices,
Right.
External circumstances, and maybe even some things we just can't fully explain.
Mm-hmm.
And while this podcast is leaning heavily on that spiritual interpretation, I think it's crucial for us to recognize that we are active participants in our own lives. We have the ability to set boundaries, to communicate our needs, to make decisions that ultimately shape our relationships.
So you're saying even if we like subscribe to the idea that God is working behind the scenes, we're not off the hook when it comes to taking responsibility for our actions, our
Yeah.
choices within those relationships.
And that's where things like self-awareness, healthy communication, a willingness to have those tough conversations, those become so important because let's face it, not every relationship is meant to last forever.
Right.
And sometimes letting go, even if it hurts, is actually the most loving and empowering thing we can do for ourselves and the other person.
It's like we're constantly navigating this dance, right?
Yeah.
Between our desires, other people's choices, and all those unexpected turns that life throws our way.
I love that analogy
Yeah.
because it really captures that fluidity,
Mm.
the complexity. And I think it's also important to remember that just because a relationship ends, it doesn't mean it was a failure.
Hmm. That's good.
Every connection, even the ones that don't last,
Mm.
they offer us opportunities to grow, to learn, to understand ourselves better.
So how do we reconcile these different perspectives? Like we've got this podcast emphasizing divine intervention, but then we've got this whole other side of the equation that's all about personal growth, making conscious choices. It's like two very different lenses.
You've hit on a really crucial point. There's rarely one single answer or explanation that can fully capture how complex human relationships are.
Right.
And that's where critical thinking is so vital.
Hmm.
We can take those interpretations, as a starting point.
Yeah.
But it's essential that we apply our own judgment, our own experiences, our own knowledge to form a more nuanced understanding.
Okay, so let's play with this idea of integrating those different perspectives. Let's say you have a listener who's really struggling with a recent loss, a friendship that ended abruptly. How would you guide them to approach this situation? Through both a spiritual and a more psychologically grounded lens.
That's a great question. One thing I might suggest is to just acknowledge and validate the pain first. Loss is loss no matter what. It's important to let ourselves grieve and process those emotions.
So don't try to bypass the hurt, but actually lean into it.
Exactly. And then from there, we can start to explore those different layers of meaning. If someone is drawn to that spiritual perspective, they might find comfort in the idea that this departure maybe was part of a bigger plan. Maybe this friendship had served its purpose. It was time for both individuals to move on to different chapters in their lives.
And for someone who's less inclined toward a spiritual explanation, what tools might they use to make sense of this ending?
Well, for them, the focus might shift toward introspection, self-reflection. They might ask themselves, what did I learn from this friendship? Were there any unmet needs that might have contributed to the breakdown? What patterns am I noticing in my relationships? And maybe most importantly, what are my takeaways from this experience
Right.
that can help me grow and make better choices moving forward?
So it's about using these experiences, even the painful ones, as opportunities for self-discovery, personal evolution.
Absolutely.
I like that. It feels empowering, like we're not just victims of circumstance.
Exactly. And I think that's a really powerful message for anyone who's going through a tough time. Whether it's the loss of a relationship, a career setback, any of those life challenges, it's okay to grieve. It's okay to question.
Yeah.
It's okay to search for meaning.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's about finding that balance,
Yeah.
between accepting what is and taking responsibility for our own growth, our well-being.
Listening to you talk about this, I'm realizing that even though this podcast frames these departures through a very specific lens, a lot of the underlying themes are actually quite universal. The need for connection, the fear of betrayal, the desire for growth and meaning. These are all human experiences that go beyond any particular belief system.
That's such a great observation. You're absolutely right. And it really speaks to the power of storytelling.
Yeah.
How even frameworks that seem limiting at first can actually offer these unexpected insights and connections across so many different perspectives.
Welcome back, everyone, for the final part of our deep dive. We've been exploring this podcast, looking at all these different reasons why people might leave our lives. And I have to say, it's really gotten me thinking, both personally and just about how we view relationships in general.
Me too, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From those more psychological explanations like insecure attachment and hindsight bias to the podcast's, whole premise of divine intervention. It's been quite a whirlwind of perspectives.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what's sticking with you the most right now?
Honestly, what I keep coming back to is this idea that even though the podcast is coming from a very specific place, spiritually speaking, so much of what they're talking about is actually pretty universal,
Right.
like that need for connection, the
Yeah.
fear of betrayal, the desire for growth and meaning. These are all just human experiences, you know? They go way beyond any one belief system.
You're so right. I think that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Spiritual, secular, somewhere in between. We all have to navigate the complexities of relationships. We all experience loss. It's just part of being human.
Absolutely. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to make sure we offer some practical takeaways for our listeners. We've explored all these different reasons why people might leave our lives, but what can we actually do with that information? You know, how can we move forward with more self-awareness, more resilience, maybe even a sense of peace about these comings and goings?
Such good questions. And I think one of the biggest takeaways here is just the power of perspective. Even if we don't fully get why someone's left our lives, we can choose how we think about that experience.
Yeah.
We can get stuck in the blame, the resentment, the self-doubt,
Yeah.
or we can look for the lessons, the growth opportunities, even the potential for something better down the line.
So even if the situation itself feels really negative, we can still choose to approach it with a more positive, constructive
Right.
mindset.
Exactly. It's about taking back our power, even in the face of loss.
Yeah.
And another tip I'd offer, focus on building healthy, balanced relationships moving forward.
Okay.
That means being mindful of who we let into our lives, setting clear boundaries, communicating our needs, and being willing to walk away from things that just aren't serving us anymore.
So it's not just about passively accepting what comes our way.
No.
It's about actively creating the kind of relationships we want.
Exactly. And that takes self-awareness, honesty, a willingness to do that inner work, to understand our own patterns and needs.
Right.
Because when we're clear on who we are and what we want, well, then we're just so much better equipped to attract and cultivate those relationships that really align with our values, our hopes, all of that.
Okay, so we've got perspective, we've got conscious relationship building. What else? What other wisdom would you offer our listeners as they kind of navigate all this ebb and flow, the people coming and going?
You know, one thing I've learned over the years, sometimes those really tough goodbyes, they're the ones that actually make space for the most amazing new beginnings. It's a cliche, I know, but it's so true.
Yeah.
When we hold on too tight to what's familiar, we might be missing out on opportunities for growth, expansion, maybe even deeper connections.
It's like trusting the process, even when it's messy.
Exactly. And remembering that we're not meant to do this whole life thing alone.
Yeah.
Friendships, romantic relationships, family, maybe even a connection to something bigger than ourselves. We are wired for connection.
Yeah, we are.
And even when those relationships end, that love, those lessons, the growth we experience, that all stays with us. It continues to shape who we are, how we move through the world.
I love that. It's like, even though people leave our lives, you know, physically, their impact stays with us, the memories, all of that just becomes part of who we are.
Exactly. And I think that's a really beautiful thought, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Because it reminds us that even when we're facing loss, we're never truly alone.
This has been such a great conversation. Feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this whole topic, but hopefully we've given our listeners something to think about.
Yeah,
Maybe some new tools to help them navigate all the ups and downs of relationships.
I agree. And at the end of the day, I think the most important message is that even though loss is just part of life, it doesn't have to define us. We
Right.
get to choose how we respond, how we learn, how we create a life
Yeah.
that's full of those meaningful connections.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave everyone with that to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep those hearts open.